we have before us the opportunity to forge for ourselves and for future generations a new world order.
This is Multipolarity, charting the rise of the new multipolar world order. So Gavin, the producer, and I decided to do a little bit of on-the-ground journalism, some on-the-ground multipolarity journalism. We traveled to a festival in Transylvania, Romania, called Tusványos, which is an interesting ideas and music festival, which every year the Hungarian Prime Minister, Viktor Orbán, and some of his entourage descend onto to meet with the local Hungarian diaspora, the Hungarian minority within Romania. It's a very interesting festival. It's good fun. But every year, Viktor Orbán delivers a speech, and it's usually a speech that's a little bit longer, that is sort of like the Hungarian State of the Nation, if people are familiar with that in the United States, kind of laying out what the government's broad strategic thinking is about the year that's passed and about the year that's going to come. And I think it's been widespread recognized that the speech this year was of particular importance because it was a highly detailed speech on the emergence of the multipolar world, not just kind of broad-based ideas, but included a great deal of detail about the things that have been happening in the world, and laid out a little bit of a roadmap for where especially Europe and Hungary might go. So to join us to discuss that speech, we can't really think of anyone better than Gladden Pappin, who is the president of the Hungarian Institute of International Affairs, which is tied to the Prime Minister's office. And so we think he would be the person to address this really, I think, world historical speech.
Great to be here on the Multipolarity podcast. Long-time listener, first-time caller, as you might say, but it's been a great podcast by which to track what everyone now is beginning to see, and you've built up quite a track record. And so I'm happy to be here to discuss this speech.
Gladden, one of the many very big ideas that Prime Minister Viktor Orbán grappled with in his speech was an attempt to divine the motivations and the logic behind Western foreign policy actions. He said that countries like Russia, for example, are quite predictable in the way that they act because their actions flow very directly from the Russian leadership's perception of Russian national interests. And Mr. Orbán said that was therefore very predictable, whereas the West is far more difficult to predict because it appears that they are not acting in their own national interests, or certainly the European powers are not. He then really expanded on this and gave a very interesting intellectual overview of how he believes that this perhaps flows from some of the intellectual movements that began in the 1960s. And from there flowed a belief that the individual self was the most important aspect or the most important body within a society. And that to properly fulfill the individual, it had to be freed of metaphysical, familial, but also national bonds. And part of this has led to an idea abroad within Western nations that the nation state really isn't so important anymore. And what's important is the sovereign individual, so to speak. Or perhaps the just individual rights, full stop. And because of that, it's, if we see that logic, it becomes a lot easier to understand Western foreign policy views. Obviously, we've seen a difference between liberal foreign policy and realist foreign policy for a long time, since the early 2000s at least. But this was a very key idea that Mr. Orbán had. And I think that ties in very much with what's happening in various societies in, say, Eastern Europe and Western Europe, and also more broadly across the world.
Well, you're right. It was a very interesting part of the speech. The question here basically is, when we look out in the world of international affairs, do we assume that nations are acting rationally or not? Oftentimes we're, for example, talking about American, let's say, woke foreign policy. You know, is the woke foreign policy that has been pursued by the Biden administration insane ideological overreach? Should we look at it that way and just throw it out, or is there some deep rationality there? A lot of the Prime Minister's speech was about what has happened to Europe in the last few years, especially since the beginning of the war. It seems from the local perspective, sitting here in Hungary, looking out into the rest of Europe, that a lot of very irrational decisions have been made. Why would one cut oneself off from cheap energy? Why would one endanger the economies that are built upon that? Why would one throw the German power of industry basically under the bus? Why would nations embrace the political risk that will come from dissatisfied populations suddenly having to pay higher prices? Every decision looks like it's been irrational from the standpoint of European nations. And so the topic in the speech at this point became, well, let's at least put on our alternative rationality hat and figure out and see if there is some reason behind this course that Western societies have taken in recent years. We could toss into the ring also the migration decisions that were made by European powers in 2015 and 2016. Do these reflect the height of stupidity or some secret esoteric rationality? Well, he pointed to the fact that there did develop, since the Enlightenment and through a number of other intellectual and political developments, a view of reason and its connection to politics that points in a very different direction from the way that we're thinking in Central Europe. And so a alternative rationality developed that nations, which have been the building block of different types of political societies since time immemorial, are actually the single most dangerous enemy for the construction of a peaceful world. So that anti-national ideal, particularly after World War II, became embedded in the creation and development of a lot of European institutions. And it has certainly affected some of the decisions. Probably not all of the decisions can be reduced to this one aspect, but many of them can, that have been made in recent years. The question is how we evaluate this at the end. Do we say, well, Western European leaders have a particular rationality and they can use that to secure their place in the international political order, and Central and Eastern European political leaders have a different, in most cases, view of what makes for rational behavior? Well, that's basically what Prime Minister Orbán concluded, with the caveat that the international system is now beginning to change in such a way that we won't be able to avoid competing internationally with one or the other solution in hand. So if you're a Western European country and think that mass migration is rational and obligatory based on your understanding of humanity, and that that also requires a shift away from your former energy sources, and that it's good to lead to a green utopia, which is going to be the key of your power. Well, for a while we've been able to avoid the grave consequences of that, but the time is coming soon when the rationality of these different visions will be put to the test, and probably they won't all be able to survive.
I suppose the proponents of liberal foreign policy ideas would provide a simpler explanation, and the explanation would be this: that ultimately countries, nations, which are democratic and broadly liberal, don't have disputes against each other. And not only that, they tend to be economically more successful, they tend to do more trade with each other, they tend to play by a set of mutually understandable rules, and therefore it's good for global security and indeed good for all of the individual countries themselves if they follow these rules. I mean, these are the arguments that the neoconservatives from the Project for a New American Century made in the 1990s, and I suppose they drew themselves very heavily on Woodrow Wilson's ideas from 1917, 1918, when he asked which kind of peace are we securing to this First World War, as he was describing. Is it going to be a new balance of power, or is it going to be something new and better? And I suppose it's that new or better ideal that the folks who, or the elites, the foreign policy thinkers who espouse and who are proponents of a liberal foreign policy would argue are the benefits of that, rather than something that's tied up with the progression of individualism and liberal progressivism within individual societies in the West. I mean, do you see any conflict there between the views of the Hungarian Prime Minister and that more simplified view of, or simplified argument in favor of liberal foreign policy?
I'm glad you brought this up, actually, and it's taking me back to graduate school almost 20 years ago, when the required international relations course basically boiled down to this one most confident result that American political science in international relations had generated, namely that liberal democracies don't go to war against one another, or that democracies don't go to war against one another. And I think you could say at that point, this was 2005 or something like that. So you'd had the 90s, and it was in the early period of the American war on terror. It wasn't quite obvious at that point how deep a morass that would lead to. It still looked like a potentially successful operation. And the situation that Western powers were in was one in which the world could be pretty easily divided for all practical purposes between democracies on the one hand and authoritarian regimes on the other. And since the US had emerged from the Cold War as the shining example of liberal democracy, and it had emerged victorious due to the collapse of the alternative type. I know you guys have talked about this way of thinking 1,000 times on the Multipolarity podcast, but just to capture it somehow, you could say that it seemed at the time that was the dominant element of the world system, and the US and Western powers simply had to react to the minor challenges and irritations here and there. So that more or less characterized the type of military operations that the US was carrying out during the 90s, and at least up until that point in the early 2000s. But if we fast forward to today, this vision of a world in which the liberal democracies are the only type that have economic growth and success and political stability, and are not bellicose by nature and tend to peaceful arrangements, etc. It looks like a mirage that's rapidly evaporating into the distance, while many of the Western powers are throwing more and more lives and energy to chasing it. And that's just my impression. I think the Prime Minister in his speech, recalled the idea that they were always taught in the socialist school system that, at the end stage of communism, the state would wither away, but between now and then it just grows stronger and stronger and stronger. Well, now it seems like the West is ever more embroiled in wars to bring about this, rapidly fading endpoint. So this way of looking at the world, it occupies, I think, a different place in the functioning of the system. It's producing decisions that are becoming more fanatical, and each of the decisions around that is beginning to engender a reaction. So 2005, even 6, 7, you were still seeing these video reports about the beautiful development of liberalism in say Afghan schools, where Western people were teaching the appreciation of modern Western deconstructive art and that sort of thing. Now the reaction is becoming fiercer. The alternatives in the world system have become more successful. It's clearly possible to have modern economic regimes that are not based on liberalism, and whether we like it or not, there's clearly a competition around that. So the mental world that has been built up around this in the West is not really adjusting very well to the new type of reactions that are occurring against it. So it's very powerful. It's very strong. It's been a key part of the domestic strength of those who articulate this position, but in the international world itself, it's, I think, leading the Western powers to a more risky situation in which their economic strength is being undermined from within. Their social stability is being challenged because of the decisions that have been made, for example, on migration, and by throwing more energy into the type of war efforts that we've seen in recent years, it's beginning to undermine its position globally as well.
Right. I think this ties into another part of the Prime Minister's speech, which is he talks about how Western values, which used to be the essence or the cornerstone of Western soft power in the wake of the Second World War, have become what he called a boomerang. He's referring to the fact that American foreign policy especially, but also some European foreign policy, very noticeably German, has turned to these kind of boutique liberal ideas, LGBT, this kind of thing. And these have become kind of substituted in for the older Western values, I suppose, of kind of, I guess we say Western powers. I'd say they were more kind of promoted American ideals, which were, nations should be self-determining and so on, and democracy is good. And so those things, which I think could, in theory at least, have broad buy-in, have been put to one side, and these more boutique ideas that have really only become fashionable in the past 15 years in Western society have been brought in to fill the void. Now, we're not here to give another sermon on the evils of woke. There's plenty of podcasts that will do that. But what the Prime Minister said, I think, is something that has been vastly under-considered. I talk about it privately all the time. He said that these Western allies have been almost falling over themselves to impose these effectively American radical cultural ideas on themselves. He noted Ukraine, Taiwan, and Japan. I assume he highlighted these because Ukraine, Taiwan, and Japan, these are not natural places for these ideas to take hold. Western Europe will be more familiar with them. Some of the ideas, come in part, ideologically at least, out of France, maybe in the 1950s, 1960s, the postmodern movement and so on. But, Ukraine, Taiwan, and Japan are fundamentally still quite conservative societies. So I think that's why he gave the example. But while they're falling over themselves to sign up to these cultural ideas, even though their populations probably aren't that interested, the rest of the world does not think like this at all. And what the Prime Minister said was that that this has become I'm quoting, Russia's strongest international attraction. Thus, what used to be Western soft power has now been transformed into Russian soft power. And what he means is that Russia effectively go around the world, their diplomats go around the world, and they say, if you don't like that stuff that you find very strange coming out of the West, well, you know, there are alternatives to that. But just to finish on that, the Prime Minister noted that China is becoming modern, India is becoming increasingly modern, the Arabs and Turks are modernizing, obviously Russia's quite a modern society. But they're not buying into these ideas. So what they're laying out is an alternative path of modernization in a sense. So I suppose if you want to speak to any point in that, I think we'd be more than happy to hear you. But the thing that fascinates me so much is that, to my estimation, these kind of woke-faced foreign diplomacy, they're not just kind of slightly embarrassing and so on. They are that. But I think these have been doing, and I think the Prime Minister is alluding to it, real material damage to diplomatic outreach on the part of the West. And they have almost definitely paved the way for broader openness in the rest of the world to alternative modes of development, which is effectively what we call on the show multipolarity.
You're right. It's all too easy to bash what people call woke foreign policy, because the idea that the U.S. is flying the rainbow flag at its embassy to the Vatican or whatever just becomes a kind of absurdist theater at a certain point. Giving an account for why it arose and what its course of development has been and why it's backfiring now, that's a much harder thing to do. And I guess you could say that there was a certain rationality, if we want to say that. There was a certain rational process happening in the American diplomatic mind in the late 1990s and early 2000s, namely, well, we won, we're successful, we have a basic program for economic development, which we will hand out to you through the Washington Consensus and the international financial institutions that have been built around that, and it'll work for you, and we'll provide protection and tell you what to do. And by the way, since all of this has reached a point of development together in the West, and you want to join that, here's basically what it will mean in social terms, and that's, implementing, and many of these were probably good reforms, some elements of modernization of social relations and things like that. Well, my idea is that when Western industry basically gutted itself out during the tech boom, after that, suddenly there was a much, much faster, elite university madness to strong industrial power pipeline. So after the tech boom and crash and reboom in the early 2000s, well, America had basically no manufacturing industry left. The political strength wasn't coming from strong Midwestern communities with big factories, but instead, well, the way to get rich is to start a social media company, start a tech company. All of these are started by like 20 or 21-year-old dropouts from elite universities who are able to live very socially liberal lives, protected basically by their elite class status, and they're practicing ever more radical things, being part of those elite, part of that elite cycle where it's like, well, the West has become modern, it's become liberal, and now it's time to become more modern and more liberal, which means no manufacturing and more radical social practices, and this is the recipe for success. And then all of these people are in the State Department too in a few years. So that's kind of the origin story, I think, and the rationality, and probably a lot of countries bought into it because there's, I don't know, from a more traditional society, some types of modernization that are necessary in the against the, I don't know, extremely archaic family structures or something like that. I won't speculate. But at a certain point, any contact between this set of ideas and reality just completely departed the field. And after the beginning of the war in 2022, the role of this began to have a really, really different set of effects. And it seems that the Western powers that are advancing the pro-LGBTQ foreign policy, or making the radical promotion of LGBT and other socially liberal ideals part of the foreign policy efforts of the West, it's almost not realistic now to expect that those will be embraced further, even by allies outside of Western Europe. But it's being actively used to kind of whip and punish allies like Hungary is, that are diverging from other parts of the foreign policy consensus. So it's somehow become a manner of internal control. This was very obvious in the American university system, where it's like from one year to the next, you don't know if you need to put the pronouns in your bio, and why do you have to? Why do you not have to? Well, it's because it's a reflection of the power of the administrators, who get to decide every year what the status of wokeness is, whether we admit that we're having this conversation in some native land or whatever, that sort of thing that they did. So it became a kind of internal control mechanism. But if you're an American ally outside of Western Europe, well, we know that South Korea, for example, needs a strong army. It has a low fertility rate. Does it need a further injection of like radical LGBTQ hyper individualism? Well, clearly not. So there are a lot of international drivers of this now, which are going to change the status of this, godforsaken and misbegotten aspect of Western foreign policy. It's become an element of internal control. It's backfiring externally, and the consequences will be starting to hurt the West soon.
Yeah, I think it's also just worth noting that it's not just that, African countries or certain Asian countries or Middle Eastern countries see these things as just alien ideas, although they do. They see them as active imperialist ideas. I mean, it should be... this is something that I don't understand, that the left and even liberals have forgotten, that, the fundamental core component of imperialism is going to another country and imposing a foreign culture on them. In fact, countries will often take a foreign administrative structure that largely leaves the culture alone, like the British Raj in India. They'll actually accept that to a certain extent. They might tolerate it. It's not an optimal solution, but they might tolerate it. Where it gets really troublesome is when an imperial power tries to impose an alien set of cultural ideas on another culture. And to my mind, when I was in university, which was not long ago, this would be what you'd be told in a kind of a sociology class or something like that, that the core of an imperialist idea is to impose foreign ideas on a country. It's very surprising to me that liberals and leftists have not spotted that, okay, they may like these ideas domestically, and some of our listeners who are leftists or liberals may like these ideas domestically, but surely they can see that when they bring these ideas to, say, Iran, it's seen as imperialism by the Iranians because they're foreign ideas. And the more foreign the idea, the more imperialistic they're seen as. And these are ideas that I think many of these countries would see as the most foreign really possible. So I think this is how Russia is flipping it. This is the boomerang, I think, that Orbán is talking about, because Russia has actually, in recent years, especially in Africa, it's dusted off the old Soviet anti-imperialist rhetoric, except rather than saying that the imperialists are capitalists who are coming along and so you need to ally with the communists or socialists in order to fight the capitalists off, they're saying the imperialists are coming with their extremely foreign cultural ideas and trying to impose them on you, and Russia has the military strength and the cultural respect for your country to help you out, and it's seeing an awful lot of actually success with this, especially in Africa and so on. So I wanted to do you have any thoughts on that, on how this movement after 1945, both the liberals and the left, I mean the kind of Kennedyites, relatively center ground liberals, were kind of anti-imperialist in their own way. They wanted to break up the British Empire. They kind of saw to that, in a sense, with Suez and so on. How that's morphed into almost an explicitly imperialist project, and how this is clearly producing an enormous amount of blowback.
Yeah, it's clearly not working anymore. Like what I was trying to say is that you might have thought that this was a kind of package that went together, that modernization, free market economics, and social liberalization were a kind of package. And so if you're like a third country, it's like, well, I should adopt these. I need to become more modern. I want more industry. I want more money. And with that comes social liberalization. Well, it's clear now that the West has been undermining itself through this. Birth rates have fallen, family formation is falling, families are broken, societies are alienated. People view the common thing as just like an area that everyone mutually gets to exploit. Obviously, doesn't describe everyone in our countries, but it's clearly a problem. Maybe we should have taken notice when, like, France, for example, which was a place which generated a lot of the modern and the postmodern ideas. Even France, because of its gendered language, some would say, even France thought, well, okay, this alternative pronouns, this self-gendering thing, like it doesn't even work in the grammar of one of the principal countries of Europe, let alone Hungary, which is a non-gendered language, or many other European languages. Like it, I mean, I know that we sometimes, as Americans, make fun of ourselves for not being good at foreign languages, but like this was a very simple wake-up call that this element of the woke foreign policy could not possibly work or be necessarily accepted as part of the package. And now it's just obvious that the social liberal ideals, nations don't matter, borders don't matter, it doesn't matter where things are made. This has led to a system that's breaking apart. It's becoming industrially weaker. It's not equipped to be as competitive in the 21st century conflicts as it thought, because turns out those look a lot like conflicts from 100 years ago. So it's just stupid. And everyone can see that now. You can see that modernization can go along with different regime types, not necessarily ones that we like or want to see in the West or would want to be a part of, but might be the ways that other political cultures have developed. And a lot of countries want to be industrially strong, get along with as many people or other countries as they can, have a kind of cosmopolitan attitude, and not become totally wrecked. And pretty much any aspiring middle power, let alone stronger power, can see that. Listening to you, Philip, reminded me of a funny period about 10 years ago when RT, Russia Today, started to project into the Western media markets. And they were offering basically edgy, even reactionary right-wing content. Lots of libertarian type content was available through RT. And people were pointing out, probably rightly, that RT was using a different front in different countries. In America, it was promoting like libertarian reactionaries in order to cause social and political chaos in America, and elsewhere it was promoting a liberal or even leftist line. I don't know, probably that was true at the time. But today the positions have kind of congealed. The Biden administration, Democratic foreign policy, is offering kind of LGBT/woke foreign policy under a form of threat, like you better do this or else vague things that are bad might happen to you. And pretty much outside of that bubble, international relations are much more practical. If you're a rising middle power, let alone a larger power, all you have to do is back off of that a little bit. You may not be able to compete with the U.S. In a complete or full manner, but as we move toward a multipolar world where more countries are practicing a multi-vector foreign policy, things are going to get much more competitive. This woke stuff has become a form of internal policing, and it's not contributing to the strength of the West anymore.
I think if the general thrust was that some of the Western prescriptions in terms of social policy and morality is damaging the US and European position internationally and damaging their ability to conduct effective diplomacy in their own interests. It seems that Mr. Orbán views the rise of Asia, in relative terms at least, as almost predetermined. He argues that they have a great demographic advantage. They've caught up and even now have technological advantages in many areas. They have the most money. They have the biggest financial funds, he said, the largest companies in the world, the biggest stock exchanges. He said now they have some of the best universities and so on and so forth. And therefore the rise of the Asian powers is essentially predetermined. He also said, though, that with the right combination of policies, with the right grand strategy in effect, the United States and more broadly North America could be very successful after the shift toward a multipolar world as well. There would always be, given the right mix of policies, an extremely powerful pole within the world. The question he asked, therefore, is, what about Europe? Where does Europe stand? And he suggested in his speech two main possible pathways for Europe. The first pathway was to end up becoming something like an open-air museum, something that people marveled at, but a place that was not open to further development. It was not competing. It was not entering the competition of the world. The other alternative was for Europe to gain some kind of strategic autonomy, to become more autonomous from the US, and to use that autonomy, to use that ability to set their own foreign policy or their own strategy in their own national interests, to go out into the world and to compete. He did offer a series of a series of necessary building blocks for that to be available. But I wonder where does Mr. Orbán see this going? Because at the moment, it seems very much Europe is heading down the path of being a kind of a beautiful holiday destination, a wonderful open-air museum, a site of magnificent architecture and some of humanity's greatest cultural achievements, but not necessarily a place that is a power in the world, not necessarily a place that can, pursue its own interests. So it's somewhere that is essentially washed along the stream, washed down the rapids of global events and global competition.
I'm reminded of this headline in the Wall Street Journal. It was about a month ago. I think it was Europe has a new economic engine, American tourists. And it was precisely this outline of the potential success of Europe as the open air museum. And it's stunning to see this, because I don't even know what the right word for it is. It's not really cope, because it's being published in an American newspaper about Europe. From a European perspective, it's even more sadly true and insulting. Like the Wall Street Journal can see that this is the direction that Europe is heading, and of course, from the standpoint of the Wall Street vacationer, they can read the weekend style guide and like buy some stuff that they need to go to the beach in Europe for a couple of weeks, and it's fine. But from a larger geopolitical standpoint, this is just going to be a huge problem for every global actor, I think, if it goes in that direction. Now, the alternative that Prime Minister Orbán referred to, it's commonly called the strategic autonomy alternative, and it's been typically takes a number of different forms, I think, but there's definitely a French form that it takes. We can think about the conflicted relationship between de Gaulle and Gaullism in French thought and NATO, for example. We can think about the French hostility toward the American invasion of Iraq. We can think of the different French vision of its economic and industrial success we can think of it as a nuclear power. All of these things are bound up in that. But in the last few years, some elements of the strategic autonomy vision, maybe not just from a French perspective, but from a Brussels or EU perspective, have been, well, the EU can be very, very strong. And you know what? Even if the United States pulls back from financing the war in Ukraine, well, we're just going to have to double our spending. We're just going to have to increase it. And I saw this version earlier in the year when the EU at the beginning of February was in the process of agreeing to another, I think, 50 billion euro tranche of financing to be distributed between 2024 and 2027 to Ukraine. And after it was agreed upon, Ursula von der Leyen said, I'm so proud, of course I'm paraphrasing, I'm so proud that Europe has done this. Sure hope America follows suit. And it's like at that time, the American financing of Ukraine was still in question. It wasn't passed until later in the spring. And it's like, well, maybe this financing thing could have been used as a bargaining chip with the United States. But for sure, the US is not going to follow Europe's lead into this, as though American congressmen would be inspired by the statements of Ursula von der Leyen to make a decision about financing the war in Ukraine. So I've chosen that as a kind of archetype, but there's maybe a little bit delusional version of strategic autonomy, which says that, you know what, if Trump comes into power, we'll just have to support the Ukrainian war effort ourselves. Well, that's not going to be a very autonomous Europe, because it's going to be a completely bankrupt Europe that doesn't even have sufficient military capability or industrial capability to deliver what it claims in that. So I think Prime Minister Orbán has been in a kind of jive with the Macron vision at times. Macron, steps a little bit out of the usual lockstep and goes to Beijing and says that Europe needs really good relations with China, things like that. Now, there are elements maybe of a more Hungarian-inflected vision of what a strong Europe would be, and that's one that has to trade on its existing strengths as a place where commercial actors from all over the world can take advantage of expertise, technology, a market of 400 million people, peace, that sort of thing. There is some kind of strategic autonomy vision that could work, but at the moment, in the last few years, Europe has either chosen or been forced to choose to be an increasingly junior partner in the Democratic Party-led, shall we say, declining Western ship.
I suppose the question I would ask about that is how to get from here to there. The idea of a Europe that is strategically autonomous, that can make its own decisions in its own interests, is very appealing. At the moment, however, both at a national and supranational level, the levers of power within Europe, whether they be in government or within the state or EU public bureaucracies, are controlled almost entirely, dominated by Atlanticists, people who believe that the EU is best served by staying behind America, essentially, by following American strategic interests. And it's difficult to imagine how that breaks anytime soon, or soon enough for Europe to avoid a fissure with China as well, because obviously the United States has a strategic interest in making sure that Europe goes along with it in terms of the ongoing economic and potentially even hot war with China. The other question I would have, if I can just ask two at the same time, Gladden, is that Europe is powerful if Europe is together. The original Gaullist logic for Europe, and you've mentioned Charles de Gaulle as a potential as a kind of an exemplar of somebody who had a certain idea, you might say, of European strategic autonomy. But the The original Gaullist idea was that by European nations coming together, they could have an extremely large economic bloc that would be big enough both to develop champions that were large enough, had large enough internal market, had big enough capitalization to go out into the world and compete with the extremely big multinational companies of the United States, and these days you might say China as well. But also because of that large market, they would have a great deal of bargaining power when it came to trade deals. And obviously they would also have the population size and economic size to produce a significant amount of military force. But of course, the downside of that is that all of the nations involved in such a bloc have to subsume at least some of their national interests in order to get the benefits of that as a whole. How does that fit with Mr. Orbán's views of national sovereignty and national interest? So first question is how to get from where we are at the moment, which is a Europe dominated both politically and bureaucratically by Atlanticists, to a Europe which is strategically autonomous. And the second question is, how would that kind of strategic autonomy fit with Mr. Orbán's view of nationalism, given it would require a certain degree of, clubbing of sovereignty to have its effect?
Well, thanks for these super easy questions. It should be really simple for us just to put together a program here in a couple minutes. And
yeah, sure. I mean, that's why they pay you the big bucks, Gladden, surely.
Well, if only Hungary's opinion were invited in for that reason, I'm sure things would be in a better situation. But look, things changed a lot immediately after 2022, and in ways that a lot of people didn't expect. I think probably none of us expected to be sitting on a Multipolarity titled podcast as of even 2.5 years ago. So things can change rapidly, and the underlying situation or rationality of different actors can be exposed more rapidly. So I would probably reply just by throwing out a few factors that might begin to shift things around. Well, Prime Minister Orbán himself referred to the possible Trump victory in November, and is viewed as a bad thing in Brussels because it would probably lead to the non-Ukraine centric vision of European strategic autonomy. And there are a lot of different pathways that a Trump administration could take, but simply by, well, not to say threatening, but pointing in the direction of an American pullback or refocus or retrenchment, the reality of the European situation will be made clearer. Another question we might ask, is Fortress America still going to be the strongest power in the world? Does Fortress America vision, which is also becomes totally protectionist. I'm not attributing this idea to Trump at all, actually, but it's a element that sometimes circulates in the nationalist discourse in America. Is the hyper protectionist version of America, the Fortress America version, going to be itself best suited for the international environment? Another question: we've seen a lot of countries that are rising middle powers, we sometimes call them, that have been able to navigate the changing world order quite successfully. Turkey, for example, Azerbaijan, another one, even some of the Gulf states as regional rising powers, all practicing a kind of multi-vector foreign policy, trading on their strengths and trying to leverage their position. Well, there doesn't have to be a gigantic 400 million person single market to have a successful middle power. So if we consider the different futures that Europe might have, well, it certainly seems that the Euro-federalist vision has led to a lot of catastrophic decisions. It's fostered a basic misunderstanding of what would be the recipe or building blocks for European strength. And it's not going anywhere. It's led to horrible decisions. The consequences of those decisions are going to become clearer in the upcoming years. So we have to admit that the geopolitical situation of Europe is not going to be like that of the United States, which is a single country astride the Atlantic and the Pacific with enormous natural resources and complete energy sovereignty and extremely advanced military technology. It's and by the way, also some deeply deep-seated, intrinsic, and very dangerous social problems that the U.S. has. Well, that's not going to be the situation of Europe. And if the more that Europe's current weakness is exposed, the more it will have to make decisions. European leaders will have to make decisions about what direction to go. If they choose the path of further disconnection from the rest of the world, their economies will become weaker. There will be more social unrest. There will be more political risk for leaders following this line. With a Trump administration or even a Vance administration after that in the US, there will be more discipline imposed upon Europe from the outside. And maybe in 5 years, the contrast between countries that are following like a pro-national sovereignty, economic connectivity approach like Hungary is, maybe that will be a more visible option. The U.S. is also not the only actor in the world anymore. That's something that has changed a lot in the last couple of years. Prime Minister Orbán pointed out in his speech, China is going around making offers. It has significant economic resources. It has investment power now. It's no longer just a story of jobs departing the U.S. for China. Even Trump in his RNC speech said that China should feel free to come to the United States and open factories. Well, that's the very policy that the Hungarian government has been pursuing, which the day before the Trump RNC speech was criticized by some on the American right. So the situation around aspects of this can change very rapidly. We shouldn't have any illusions. Europe is in a very dangerous situation. It's been eviscerating its industrial core. It's been reshuffling its traditional power balances without any kind of rational endpoint in sight. And we don't know if the exposure of its situation will lead to a change. But it's clear today that there are alternative models within Europe, and that at some point in the next few years, although the time seems to be every day running out, there will be a time for choosing.
Another thing in the speech that really stood out was a description of what Europe's actually become. Now, on the show, we highlight all the time that there's basically no leadership in Europe. The Prime Minister said this in his speech explicitly, that the leadership that does exist, the leaders that do exist, are some combination of stupid and weird, I'd say. Viktor Orbán laid it out in a more kind of systemic manner, which I think has a lot of explanatory power to it. And he basically said that prior to the Russia-Ukrainian war, European power was based on the Paris-Berlin axis, as he called it. I'm sure our listeners know exactly what that means. They're the two biggest, most powerful countries in Europe. Germany was the economic powerhouse. France was the diplomatic and sort of military powerhouse, but more so diplomatic. And, that's how they kind of ran Europe as a bloc outwardly facing. And that anchoring point, it led to problems of its own with the austerity programs after 2011 and so on. But ultimately, it provided some sense of ballast and stability in Europe, and it made Europe something. It made it a coherent power player in the world. Viktor Orbán pointed out that since the war, the Berlin-Paris axis basically has collapsed. Or at least is completely irrelevant. And the new power, it's hard to know what to call it because it's not quite a power center, but the new axis comprises London, which isn't even in Europe anymore, so it's very unusual, Warsaw, Kiev, again, not in Europe, the Baltics and the Scandinavians. And apart from London, which is an unusual case, what the other centers of power, again, I don't really want to use the term, dispersions of power, hold in common is that these are not very important countries. Many of them are quite small. Some of them have small militaries. The ones that have large militaries tend to be economically underdeveloped. And there's no real commonality between any of these except maybe some vague anti-Russian sentiments, or sometimes not so vague. So it's hard to know what to call this formation. It doesn't look workable. It sort of seems like a power nexus through which DC just channels its power. I'm not really sure what to think of it, but I think it's very, very important, and people should talk about it more. So what do you make of these comments on the switch from the Berlin-Paris axis to the power nexus, as it were?
Well, I think that this is the first time that a European political leader has called this out in a critical way. You know, if we look back at the beginning of, I think it was really the beginning of 2023, when you started to see this cycle of articles through all the elite newspapers and journals. The New York Times had, like, Ukraine war accelerates shift of power in Europe to the east. And there were dozens and dozens of headlines like this. NATO's new center of gravity is Finland and Norway and whatever, off to the east. And you saw so many of these, all implying that as you put it, the classic Franco-German nexus of economic and military as well, power, had shifted to the east. So the first thing we could ask is, well, what kind of new system is in place in Eastern Europe? Are we seeing a very, very close alignment, or is there a new, I don't like this word minilateral, but like, is there a new minilateral platform that has emerged? Well, prior to this, there was the Visegrad cooperation, the V4 cooperation between Poland, Czech Republic, Slovakia, and Hungary, which had been built up as a way of beginning to coordinate the political, economic, cultural, to a certain extent, defense, security, migration-oriented efforts of Central Europe. And it wasn't really intended as a big counterbalancing operation or a gigantic bet, but it's something that was beginning to emerge naturally after a century or more of chaos in the region. Well, what really happened after the beginning of the war is that a number of countries placed 100% bets that America's security focus would permanently shift to Eastern Europe in a way that would maximize their position within Europe. And I guess they thought about this one of two ways. At the beginning of the war, it's like, well, Western support is going to cause Ukraine to win right away, and when it does, all of the support will have gone through Poland and Romania and the Baltics, and that'll be the new focus. Well, when that didn't happen, I guess that the alternative vision is like, well, there's still going to be a permanent security situation here, so there's going to be massive American capital coming in order to at least offset the military purchases that are being made in these countries, massive future effort there. Well, none of these led to a kind of coherent discussion among the Eastern European powers as to their natural interests, their shared geography, their shared security situation. It was really like just a gigantic bet. The U.S., which had been giving its priority military bases to Germany, would send massive amounts of arms and weapons and bases and hopefully eventually soldiers and everything else individually through each of the Eastern European capitals. So instead of there being a new emergent Eastern Europe cooperation, it was really just a set of differing financial flows. Washington to Warsaw, Washington to Kiev, Washington to Bucharest. Really, it represented a heightening of the power of the Biden administration in each of these capitals. The question is now, what is likely to happen in the next few years? The American appetite for supporting the war effort has declined across the board. It's not the principal issue in the American election. It never was. It was always an operation of the kind of permanent war bureaucracy in Washington. It didn't have gigantic political support, particularly when there are other big-ticket economic items on the agenda for everyday Americans. The situation is bound to change, and when it does, what then? If the center of gravity has really shifted to Eastern Europe, what is the platform that has emerged out of that? And if our answer is NATO, which is a strong and great and powerful organization, well, that already existed, and maybe it's kind of putting its focus in one area now, but it can put its focus in another area. The thing about the V4 cooperation when it existed is it was a real platform among 4 sovereign countries whose leaders were coming together, they still do meet, in order to hash out the issues, in order to become to forge a kind of shared identity. And so this set of headlines that we all saw throughout 2023 turns out not to describe a very accurate political and geopolitical situation. And in Prime Minister Orbán's speech, I think it drew a lot of international attention. His comments, which were specifically about the Polish situation. But, well, is it really so wise to doubt the enduring power of the French economy or the French military, which is a nuclear power in Europe? Surely if there's a reason why the strategic autonomy discourse came out of there. Of course, there are a lot of different new cooperations that it could emerge, because for sure the chessboard has been scrambled. But point is that these articles, which were all saying there's a new Eastern European center of gravity, it's coherent, it's whole, that was kind of an epiphenomenon to the real thing, which was massive financial and military transfers with, however, a likely expiration date. And the question is, what then?
Yeah, I think just really quickly, it should be noted what this kind of support looks like. I think my sense is that a lot of these countries during that period that you talk about, where we got these headlines about a shift of focus and, a shift to the east and all that, they seem to think of American financial power in a sense as magical. I'd start by noting that of the a couple of centres that I noted there directly from the speech, London is bankrupt. We're covering the Prime Minister's speech today, but otherwise on the show, we probably would have covered the fact that Labour, as we predicted on the show, is now launching massive austerity in Britain, and a large part of that is due to energy price guarantees in the war. So London is bankrupt. Kiev, it's bankrupt. Kiev's been bankrupt for years, and as you say, the support will eventually run out. The front lines aren't going so well. So those two have kind of collapsed under their own weight. Warsaw, the Baltics, and the Scandinavians, and you also mentioned Romania, they don't really get the same type of financing. Now, London didn't get any financing. I've never really understood why the UK goes along with this stuff, but they do. For whatever reason, they don't get anything out of it. But the other countries, they tend to get financing not like directly from the government. They don't get foreign aid transfers like Ukraine does. They get foreign direct investment, often in the form of private equity and so on. And I think what they haven't really woken up to is that these are private capital flows, and private capital flows can start and stop, whether that be with a recession or whether it just be with a Trump administration that says we want to now to domestically focus our capital investment. And so I think a lot of these countries have had a very warped sense of what the US can actually provide, number one, and number two, the level of permanence to that. I don't know if you have any final thoughts on that sort of magical thinking that I've certainly seen in the Central and Eastern European region, not obviously with Hungary, but with some other countries, and in the Scandinavians, of course. I think they're totally on board with this magical way of thinking. They seem to think if you have a small tech hub in a city, that you've somehow, got an economic program or a military program or something.
Yeah, that's kind of what I was trying to allude to when I said that there has been a lot of investment flow in order to offset these hardware purchases and so on and so forth. I think that there is a lot of political risk around expecting that type of behavior from American companies, because American companies ultimately, even though they may have a strong tie to the state or strong incentives or strong arming that's placed on them, ultimately they are more rational actors than pure state companies. So if there are tons of American companies that have been encouraged to open up factories and things like that in Poland, well, we'll have to see what actually happens there. Even the Poles have been hedging their bets with regard to China, and there have been a number of positive communications and exchanges between Poland and China. They seem to be aware that Europe's situation in the relationship with China is one in which they're not going to be as easily able to go in lockstep if they're pushed aggressively by the United States. Even the Italian Prime Minister, Giorgia Meloni, appears to have had some second thoughts about that this week as well. I'm sure we'll talk about that another time. So I think there's a lot to watch here, and the geopolitical dividing lines within Europe, or the different accents, are beginning to become a little bit clearer. There's now a sovereigntist, populist government in Slovakia that has taken power under the Prime Minister Robert Fico, who also suffered an assassination attempt this spring. And, Slovakia and Hungary share a very, very close history. They were, in effect, a shared part of the same political system for many, many years. And kind of because of their geographical situation as well, see the war effort and their own interests in a similar way. It's probably no accident from a geo-economic standpoint that the Chinese president visited Belgrade as well as Budapest. Again, that's a kind of shared and natural geopolitical environment. So the V4 group represented something like that. One of the members, Poland, began to take a different path and to make this 100% bet on Washington, at least at some level. But not everyone sees it that way. A lot of people are beginning to see that Europe's situation isn't as simple as they thought. The war is not playing out like they thought. The investment situation between the US and China isn't playing out as they thought. The stability of the Western powers seems to be shaky. Again, put yourself in the mindset of a Brussels bureaucrat who views the advent of a second Trump administration as like an existential threat. That's a form of political instability from their perspective. There's a lot going on, and certainly more than we can settle in a short conversation, but at least things are interesting.